But I want to talk in particular about the contribution of architecture to progress of freedom. And that's one way to think about societal progress. It seems we are ever becoming ever more free and empowered in the world. And that has many kind of forms that takes. I mean, just superficially, you could say modernism, the kind of free-flowing space, from inside to outside, from space to space, is one form, or the freedom afforded by the indifference of the grid, where you suddenly have more degrees of freedom of placing and building up a cityscape. Maybe the freedom of long spans and kind of uninhibited movement in interiors, like all this kind of three-dimensional space of flying when you have porous atria and three-dimensionally porous buildings. Or the freedom to expand city unboundedly, whereas it used to be kind of encapsulated. But maybe these are kind of relatively superficial notions of freedom we encounter as architects. It's also the degrees of freedom we have as designers. They have been increasing. So now we have the endless forms of nature nearly and more at our disposal in some of our works. We're working on all scales and all the program domains. That the kind of universal competency I've talked about is expressed in Zardin architects in all regions, in all climates, in all program domains, on all scales, from urbanism to interiors and fashion. But I mean, so these dimensions of architectural freedom we kind of superficially or intuitively encounter need to be unpacked and related back to, let's say, societal progress and freedom as the destiny of human history. And that's something which Hegel came up with. How can freedom be defined? So I would say freedom is this capacity to search a path through the universe. And in a way, it's a kind of very, very fundamental quality of any mobile creature, that you need some degrees of freedom to kind of get out of harm's way and towards some kind of nutrition or something. So these kind of, any sense of constrainment there is for any organism who is mobile and has to search a path through the universe problematic. So it's an instinctive revulsion to anything being constrained, because it actually inhibits your life, your vitality. So that's Dennett's move. So freedom is advantageous, and therefore most sentient mobile creatures instinctively cherish freedom and resist shackles and controls. It's the absence of constraint. And so the beginning of freedom of action of a living creature is foraging and to move out of harm's way. The more degrees of freedom a creature acquires, the greater are its chances to persist and reproduce. So our kind of love for freedom is incredibly deeply rooted, and we share that with any kind of mobile and sentient creature as being an advantage we would have. However, beyond free random exploration and immediate uninhibited reflexes, it can be advantageous to build up complex chains of action that offer later but greater rewards. In human terms, this is work, and that requires some kind of self-control. So there's kind of interesting dialectic here of building up an empowerment, moves you can make in the world, but kind of not instant quantification. So we're getting into some interesting economics discourse here already. So the next step first step for that kind of more complicated story of freedom is not always being always free to make the move. You build up capacity to move more effectively, and that temporarily you plan and self-control. The next major move here is where it seems to be kind of this dialectic of freedom is when it comes with the emergence of corporate work and the realization of associated productivity gains, material freedom, I will talk about it later. And to secure these advantages requires both self-control and social control. That is restriction of individual freedom. And that's something we need to be aware of. And that's also what architecture delivers. It brings us together, but also separates and controls. So regimes of social control is one of the things I want to talk about. at the oasis of liberty. So rules are required also, and it's another aspect, to define how everybody's freedom is limited by everybody else's freedom, and we know that. And there are different definitions of freedom. Adam Smith, Hayek focus on free use of one's knowledge. And there's this kind of phrase from Liberland, I got into the libertarian movement through Liberland, slogan, live and let live. That's great, but the slogan suggests that we should not interfere with each other's individual pursuits, fair enough. This fits the kind of parallel subsistence life best, but does not recognize that the prosperity we presume depends on integrated, highly interdependent lives. That is, on productive social cooperation coordinated via an organized or market-mediated division of labor. Both require more specific forms of constraint and discipline than merely live and let live, what I've hinted at already previously. So we're talking about the power of division of labor, which also is expressed in the law of comparative advantage, but also Marx recognizes that this kind of subordination which we achieve, that I call it material freedom, we'll see that later, the distinction between material and social freedom, that kind of empowerment, subordinating of the forces of nature themselves is a product of common labors, and is actually that communality and power is represented and concentrated in the capital structure and becomes materially manifest and is built on cumulatively. And Mises also talks about, of course, the power of cooperation in the so-called law of society formation. He's saying that's why societies exist, because of the productivity, empowerment and productivity which cooperation requires. That's kind of deep evolutionary raison d'etre of society, why societies exist. But we also need to emphasize, at least in my philosophy, progress, innovation. So not being happy to stand still. We've achieved and we're reproducing a social order and the kind of the level of freedom, but we want more. 10 years, 20, 30 years on, we want to continue that incredibly human trajectory, that prosperity engine which is continuously accelerating. Because that's what's the great story of the last. Use freedom to develop a more sophisticated and light-footed and elegant and efficient social order, with maybe new forms of discipline, which are more kind of self-disciplining and more soft and more kind of moral rather than physical. And we are in this period where I believe that a massive expansion of individual liberties, it could actually deliver an enormous expansion of material freedoms. But this depends on new technological conditions which make possible the shift from Fordism to post-Fordism, which is actually the microelectronic revolution, so the computational empowerment and telecommunicational empowerment technologically allow for totally new degrees of creativity. I mean, this technological system, capital structure on the right, has an enormous capacity for absorbing innovation. Because it's just these robotic systems can be reprogrammed at any time, monthly, weekly. Or the services where you upload a new app to globally to billions of people every hour. So it's worthwhile to produce an innovation every day. And that's where these people who used to web, but this system couldn't. There's no point in being creative because this assembly line has to amortize with the same car for the next 20 years. And then innovation is maybe a slight tinkering of that. And the civilization which produced only 5 products, a washing machine, cornflakes, a packaged holiday, a car, and a mass-produced house. So, and you see also you still had the people kind of locked onto the assembly line. So from moving from here to here, that's dramatic and epochal, there's nobody there anymore. Where are these characters? They're actually in that dynamic ecosystem of creative R&D, marketing, financing, and they're concentrated back into an urban condition where they are this communication and knowledge workers, which continuously can reprogram these. So that's, and this social order of the firm was brutally hierarchical. You were told what to do, and it was 9 to 5, routines, command and control, even under capitalism. In a capitalist firm for 30 years, for 50 years. And here you have to, you let loose, you have degrees of freedom, but also anxiety that you have to fit yourself into a network of collaboration with your own intelligence, with your own responsibility. And again, the built environment's contribution is ordering of social process. So we're moving from ordering this kind of social process to ordering this kind of social process. And this diagram, the organigram, is actually also the diagram of the modernist institutional building. And this is some kind of glimpse of what the contemporary city and contemporary building should be looking like. Again, so we have to, when I went to this kind of lecture, look not only at the coordination and cooperation as a positive process of social order, but also we're looking at the control element. Because we cooperate, but we're also inherently kind of free riders and defectors. And there is kind of, shortcuts where you want to reap the benefit without doing it, putting in and so on. So the control element was always there as well. And architecture is involved in both. Spatial inscriptions to empower the coordination, the positive cooperation, but also restrictions, keeping controls going. So social coercion, social control, is kind of double bind. And architecture delivered also the machinery of control. Borders, walls, fences, locks. I mean, it's still all over the place. In a place like crime-ridden place, Central America, there's a lot of that. And, I haven't talked about this. I haven't thought about this. I was only on the positive side, because open textures, freewheeling, open porous, no border places, cities, firms, open bureau landschafts, no cellularization, everything porous and open, but there's also this, and we can't forget it. And in any case, city is society, and has always been. So it's a human universal, as I said, this kind of artificial built environment is actually the engine of cultural evolution, because you need a material substrate upon which the process of trial error, small increments, accrue, select, reproduce, continue, be playing, and you need, like, the DNA of cultural evolution is in fact the built environment, the system of tools, artifacts. So if I'm interested in becoming human, from animal to human, by differentiating a social order, and as a designer, I'm also interested not only in the built environments, but also in, let's say, the fashion systems, the kind of demarcations of social roles, personas, identities constructed through and visualized, conspicuously represented through these investment in a semiology of body of people, but also of the built environments of everything. So for me, the design is also always semiotics and semiology. And you can imagine, I mean, this is look like fun and funny, but of course, and it's human universal, bone-breakingly poor people making all this effort into these kind of decorations. Of course, this is a life necessity. Only those tribes survived who made these investments. So it's like a necessary organ of these creatures. And both respect to the built environment they're investing in and respect to the, let's say, graphic overlay. And social structure and social order always comes along with frames, with ordering, matrices and demarcations. And we still, the fashion system, you have your whole wardrobe. I mean, the amount of money we're spending on this aspect means something, because you needed to sort yourself to communicate yourself into complex social matrix, but also the spatial arrangements which allow any productive communicative interaction like this seminar requires a certain social spatial order, a space and a place and a social spatial diagram for everything we encounter. And in a way, the body politic or the social body of Hobbes, the Leviathan, is depicted as this kind of cooperative agglomeration of all these people which generate all the kind of organ of the social body. That's the frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan, but look at the bottom. That's the metaphor. And that's the reality of the social order becoming materially manifest. That's the city. City equals society. And of course, without that, there couldn't be social processes, the ordering of social processes. And that is always, and universal. When you see the scenes is always like this, where you have the different settings and the different costumes and the different players and actors. So they know what the various roles and also rights are. And I want to look at architecture as the architect's task is the ordering of social processes. I'm saying we should always look at our designs with how it distinguishes groups, brings together and orders the actors in the particular institutions these spaces create and establish. So any architectural drawing without those peoples and personas isn't an architectural drawing. It might be a kind of technical drawing. It might be an engineering drawing or contractor's project. It's not the architectural project. Unless you can close your eyes and imagine trivially, stereotypically, where these various people configure, but in an innovative, forward-moving, transformative design language, you need to put in what you mean by this, these actors. And we're doing the social ordering through both organization, where you displace, distance physically and make proximate, and group, divide, connect physically, but also through articulation, as I said, that these different zones and territories are marked and with a kind of semiological graphical overlay. So here we're going. So architecture, as I said, is designing with the social process, framing and shaping and capturing the social process. And each building comes with a protocol of do's and don'ts, who's admitted, who belongs, and what the various activity ranges are, because our activity ranges are kind of so huge, they kind of have to be constrained in each space. Only some things are possible and others are not possible. So there's a place, space, everything. So I'm looking at building these kind of models, so the free agents, and we now self-select and sort into an architecturally offered order. That the offering implies or indicates, in this case, a pairwise ordering, 2 positions per cube, is not geometrically or physically forced. It's maybe suggested, but it's determined by an arbitrary language. So these characters understand what these cubes invite them to. So we're having physical arrangements, but we also have always an interpretation, a language, a semiotics, an understanding of the protocols. And that's where we need to look at architecture. And the model would be something like this. The different demarcation lines and types of lines and curbs and surface types and lights and traffic lights and signs, we need all these kind of semiological material, graphic semiological spatial systems to allow for this complex traffic system to evolve, where you have cars, bicycles, buses, trams, pedestrians, etc., all moving on their way, but they have to be coordinated and kind of channeled and ordered. And this is just, of course, a very, very primitive and simple system, but the whole city operates like this. Ordering social processes through a semiological overlay on top of the spatial organization. And that's why we're talking about information-rich environment. This certainly is an information-rich environment, because you have to be able to understand all these types of lines and surfaces and signs and so on. But these are also information-rich environments. You have to understand them exactly the same way that you understand what the various surfaces, edges, colors, territories, and they're not necessarily physical barriers, they're thresholds which demarcate, and once you cross the threshold, a new set of social protocols has to be adhered to. And since everybody who's crossing that understands that, everybody's on the same page with respect to expectations, and that's the definition of the social situation. And there are too many social situations. Without that definition, no meaningful communication or social interaction could ever take place. We couldn't even know what's on. But what's on is always inscribed in the space. And so there's also the whole government machinery. There's only a social machinery through that apparatus, which structured an integrated cooperative process, which is both facilitating cooperation at the same time requiring social control. So I like these images where you can see that social order requires spatial order, and you always have the various spaces and niches. Everything is used for certain interaction processes, and everybody has particular costumes. There's particular social roles in particular places with particular activities. And that's what we're talking about. Okay, so that's one segment. Now, social order living together. Now I'm getting into a bit more harsher and harder territory, but also even multiple species. You have symbiosis, for instance. You have an ecology. You have mutualism, working together. Commensalism, which is where you can have parallel lives and you kind of indifferent, maybe one is feeding off the other, but it isn't harming, but the benefit isn't mutual. But you also have parasitism. There are various kind of life processes. One feeds on the other, one drags down the other, but as long as he doesn't kill the other, there's kind of parasitism. And I find this kind of interesting, kind of exploitation in the social realm within the species, within society. Parasitism. Was that parasitism? Is slavery parasitism? And, or is it mutualism with an uneven distribution of burdens and benefit? What does it depend on? And do these categories fit here? I find it an interesting question. Because there's certainly social control, and we said earlier social control is necessary, and it becomes kind of very one-sided. What do we do? But maybe these slaves had safer and more proliferous lives within this social order, which as a total was much more empowering than the smaller tribal conditions, that even that might not be an easy to be decided questions. Even the use of force is not necessarily an indication that condemnable exploitation is at play. Hierarchy and force might be necessary to maintain a social order that delivers a new level of material freedom for all, highly unevenly distributed. But everybody's better off. Perhaps. Maybe not in the case of slavery. We don't know. We have to look at the particulars. Is this parasitism or mutualism with uneven distribution of burden and benefits? This depends. Again, was being a slave within civilization advantageous over being free outside? Did slave populations reproduce and proliferate, or did slavery depend on continuous predatory conquest and fresh enslavement, which it was in the Roman Empire, for instance? And where they run out of tribes to conquer, they kept the slaves in barracks and didn't reproduce, they didn't have family, didn't really burning through slave populations. So maybe that was parasitism, I would argue it was, on a biological level. But they're not necessarily all forms, but how about serfdom, serf relations, feudalism? Serfdom under feudalism was, for centuries, probably without a better alternative in terms of the best mix between material and social freedom, even if there's degrees of unevenness in this, of course. And here it's important, and you see, of course, architecture always involved in maintaining these cooperative and controlling structures, keep people in their place. And I was just saying, recurring peasant revolts did not lead to a new social system for hundreds and hundreds of years. So these rebellions were only kind of backward, destructive. And if one rebel group proceeds, it will only proceed maximum to re-establish the same kind of feudal hierarchical order that just became the new masters. And that we need to remember Marx saying, so that if there's no new technological cultural conditions, that's the best there was. So material freedom versus social freedom. Division of labor and cooperation requires social organization and rules of cooperation, social order, yes. The hierarchy and discipline required to establish a productive corporate social synthesis is hard to distinguish from predatory and exploitative parasitic admixtures. Only a comparative analysis of different concurrent societies operating with historically given material technologies and the competition between these societies, all on a similar level of technology, can distill and expose and then control and reduce that mixture of predation. So you have the discourse, you have various kinds of monarchies and feudal conditions, and then the one which is kind of excessively predatory to the point of being parasitical and exploitative, the tyrannical ruler versus the good king, that's where you find out where the admixtures are, and the presumption of the historical experience is that the evolutionary competitive process weeds out the tyrants, and the good kings are where these societies flourish. But there's still going to be that radical, brutal stratification of the feudal order as a necessary social condition for the material freedom which was attained at that level. So it can, to some extent, but of course, that evolutionary process isn't weeding out. There's always coming back that predatory overshooting of social control, and that gives the role to kind of liberation up to kind of equilibrium, but never beyond. So perhaps we can assume that the long time span across which various human groups were experimenting with various forms of social order and regimes of control relative to a given technological stage led to a nearly exhaustive search for humanly possible and economically advantageous societal orders at each technological stage. And you find that the pervasiveness and duration of feudalism across cultures testifies to this. There's this kind of, this really exhaustive search and stabilization of something which becomes the best that can be put together with human organisms and various domesticated plants and animals and certain technologies. And that's why I find the feudalism in Japan is very incredibly similar to feudalism in Europe and in China. They discover social institutions took centuries. So the continuous competition between various societies kept the ever-latent possibility of predatory and exploitative forms of social control in check. Tyrants and tyrannies were kept in check by the example of the relative long-term prosperity of good and wise rulers and regimes with no or less predatory admixture. What I said earlier, so here I've written it down as well. So, and maybe that even works with respect to slave societies. Now, the fact that a lot of these more complex social orders were initiated by conquest and one group establishing itself on top of another doesn't mean that thus created more advanced form of social order is inherently and forever a kind of parasitism. But of course, then there are moments when anachronistic slavery is kind of continues beyond its historical necessity. It becomes the case for liberation kind of becomes overwhelming. No, this is the 19th century. I mean, we're way beyond. So these kind of conditions are both sort of abysmal, but it's a historical condition. It's relative to historical possibilities always that liberation and liberty becomes an urgency, and social revolutions become unleashing of development potential. Whereas without these preconditions, they're just rebellions that throw societies back. And that still happens a lot. The Arab Spring didn't deliver much, kind of meant a kind of retrogression. But since there is these concepts and problems and issues of predatory admixture, of exploitation, of parasitism in the various degrees, the presumption that this is at play in capitalism is also quite obvious. Of course, I believe that capitalist class structure isn't a parasitical and exploitative relationship. I do not believe that. Regimes of social control, so in terms of architecture's contribution, territory, property, access, exclusion, protocols on the side of control. Good fences make good neighbors. So then, that's a new part of my discourse. Before, it was always kind of, because we're in the stage where we have to break down the barriers, open the gates, open the fences. That's the period we are in now in terms of moving from Fordism to post-Fordism. It's been the story. More liberty delivers more prosperity, but if you look at the total history, you cannot say so. Architecture is the expression of the very being of society, that which orders and prohibits with authority express itself in what are architectural compositions. And I subscribe to this, and we need to understand the potency of architecture for social ordering as architects. So we know that we actually have important contributions to make, and we can also make severe mistakes when we get we don't wake up to the new level of social freedom which society can afford, and how this might mean a new architecture. And of course, oftentimes the kind of storming of the Bastille, the kind of raiding of the city walls, of breaking down of these fences and barriers were the expression of rebellions, and it might be just pure destruction. Or it might be revolution allowing for the next stage. And it really depends. That's the revolt against architecture. Storming the Bastille is symbolic of the state of affairs. It is difficult to explain this impulse of the mob other than by the animosity the people hold against the monuments which are their true masters. And of course, that might be just frustration with that order which continuously blocks instant gratification and appropriation of what the social rules have allowed some of us to accumulate. And he said this: if you attack architecture, whose monumental productions are now the true masters all across the land, gathering the servile multitudes in their shadow, enforcing admiration and astonishment, order and constraint, you are the same way attacking man. It's not only attacking society, but man is, of course, a creature of society, and architecture is a necessary substrate of society. So there's no human without architecture. So this is very important to distinguish socio-economic epochs. And on the left, communism is the kind of original communism of the hunter-gatherer tribes. Not sure how communist that was. And you have the various political regimes. Let's say communism, slavery, feudalism, mercantilism, capitalism, intervention, socialism. Let's take more the social political regimes. Socio-economic regimes, let's call them. And there on the right, you have more the kind of technological reproduction principles. And of course, they were wrong to presume that socialism and communism will follow from capitalism or interventionism. But capitalism itself, of course, became, as you have these huge concentrations of capital, when you go from 5,000 steel manufacturers to 5 or 3 in a nation, and from 1,000 banks to 3 banks, and these become large kind of integrated production bureaucracies. You have a lot of non-market command and control planning in these big corporates. So this kind of idea that this continues, and then you kind of substitute the managers by some kind of state management, wasn't totally out of line kind of theoretically. It was a possibility. And then we kind of, also intervention became easy if you had, when 5,000 steel manufacturers became 5, they can sit in the back room and plan their relations, not only internally within their firm, but also arrangements and carve up the economy. So you get, that the state comes, and then they call the state, because when they made these cartel arrangements, of course, they kind of cheated each other and they wanted to kind of force each other. But it's something which isn't an ideological conspiracy. It's false theory ought to begin with. Anyway, so I believe in interventionism was the judgment for me is out whether this was still progress, it was quite a universal phenomenon, or whether there's already the fall down, the kind of the ideologically distorted backlash in the era of Fordism and mass mechanical reproduction was certainly semi-spontaneous, but certainly post-Fordism was calling for neoliberalism and now I believe anarcho-capitalism. The full-on libertarian revolution would unleash enormous prosperity potentials, particularly in the face of these new technological takeoff moments with AI and robotics, etc. That's what I believe. So let's go through them. And each time there's a very particular urban morphology which represents that. And you can see the kind of social organ of the market and the various craft streets, and the church. You still need it. It's a universal as well. Religion, Durkheim says, God equals society. The sense of reverence and holding sacred in God is actually the community, which everybody depends on and needs a kind of commitment. And that the way this kind of crystallizes out of agricultural language in more or less equal, optimized form for this era, thousands of cities like this, medieval cities. And they're all similar size, same diagram, same reproduction system. And then comes the big bang of architecture, where early capitalism, the city-states, Renaissance, you have, for the first time, architecture. So all of this was unplanned. I mean, nobody needs to plan it. You have a burg, you have an initial enclosure which is more or less circular because it's most efficient materially, and then you just build out concentrically. I mean, this is and kind of near an inevitable formation which grows and crops out of the agricultural, hinterland, if you like a bacteria or any other natural form has a kind of evolutionary, economic, morphological emergence. And then the ideal city of the Renaissance is basically the same diagram, just rationalizing out kind of distortions and irregularities which come out of the more haphazard agglomeration. And then the various institutions are kind of planted and planned, and then you are off at a much accelerated pace because this kind of evolutionary trial and error process of evolving these cities is now transferred onto paper, and the success and failure is discursively appraised through argument and counter-argument. And then we have an architectural discourse with drawings and books. So architecture comes along with drawings, separating construction out into design, and then because you can out-innovate on paper, and you're not just doing what you've always done, you need theory, you need to argue, you need to tell why you're changing things. You're surprising people with a new design. We need some reason and argument. So that architecture starts with drawings, graphic simulations, and theory in architectural books, which print the diagrams and drawings and argue for them. And also you have perspective. You actually simulate what it's like. Because you're not just doing what has always been done. You're doing something new. You need to kind of convince people. But then very, very rapidly, you can move on and you can speculate further. But this also aligns with something else. This is already mercantilism, absolutism, Louis XIV's France, the Baroque or the papal Vatican state, etc. And you have a much, much larger social integration of that huge state apparatus, administrative apparatus. That complex of Versailles isn't just an additive of a few central buildings which have very little power. The Renaissance style is additive, has very little power to generate a huge integrated structure like this where you sense the integration and unity across a very, very large complex. You get these kind of drawings also, they're cut out to the horizon, you build canals and streets, and you integrate a territory, not just a city-state. So that's what the Baroque represents, and the stylistic resources of Baroque, which is asymmetry in the part to generate a large overall symmetry, using curvature to integrate larger wholes, colossal orders, deep relief for distant viewing, all the features of the Baroque are geared towards generating an overall integral social organism on a huge scale where you sense the integralness and orderedness totally outside the capacity of the Renaissance. Then the next is, of course, industrialization and new technologies coming on, energy going to the rivers, the urban sprawl, the kind of mercantilist planned Baroque city is substituted by these kind of outcropping and sprawling new industrial towns, and they break the aesthetic sensibilities. They're ugly, they're agglomerative, and in a sense, architectural theory needs to catch up, and it does through aestheticizing and validating the vital. It's a kind of retrospective aestheticization of this in the writings of the aesthetic of the picturesque, for instance, of Logier. He endorses the uproar and tumult and surprising texture of the new city. You have laissez-faire capitalism, and you have this historicism and the aesthetic of the picturesque, multiple styles agglomerating, and also more diversity of express the different institutions which are now cropping up, the museums and council houses and railway stations, etc. And you have this kind of romantic, picturesque agglomerations and aestheticization of that industrial city, which bursts the capacities of the Baroque city-state. By the way, Marx and Engels are the great fans of capitalism, as I said, and also realize that's why the cities, these enormous cities, start to emerge, and they love it to push us out of a rural idiocy and bring in more and more people into some kind of a germane, sophisticated, cosmopolitan culture through cities. And the next stage after this is, in fact, a kind of state interventionist. So this looks like a kind of Henry Ford Detroit plant writ large as a planned city. This kind of idea of separation, specializing, and repetition. These are the principles of modernism you find everywhere, in every machine, in every building, in every cityscape. And you have the districts, the business district, the residential district, the logistics and retail and distribution district, and the manufacturing district. And what comes to mind, before everything was fitted into the same building, the same pre-given morphology. And here we have now radical differentiation and separation and specialization, morphological specialization and differentiation of these various types and parts of the city, but internally they're repetitive. So there's the house and residential unit of the minimal existence. You also have a mechanical reproduction system which can produce millions of houses for everybody if they're equal, but if you want a special one, it costs 100 times that. And everybody has their car and their washing machine, etc. Universal consumption standard. So the egalitarian, the equalization you find ideologically expressed in the period of the early half of the 20th century is actually physically prescribed. Because that differentiation is physically impossible. And being much wealthier makes no sense. I mean, what are you going to have? 5 packages of cornflakes every morning, 5 washing machines, and 5 cars, Volkswagens? That makes no sense. So the kind of equalization, there's a universal consumption standard, and everybody also has to contribute the same, 9 to 5, slot in, and that repetition, seriality is the mechanical mass reproduction. And it's also homogenization of lives, of people, of standards. So you need to think this kind of physicality, and the image of the city, that's Le Corbusier from the 1920s, it's prescience. The world didn't look like this at all in 1920. This is Corbusier. And this is the world of trade unions and 9 to 5 and mass workers and so on. Mass mechanical production, that's the model of the industrial city. It's actually industrial, large conglomerate. You see separation, specialization, repetition, and it came through and delivered. And we see later, it's exactly what was striking, that the vision of Corbusier became evident, was true. So it wasn't a mistake. It was incredibly prescient. And what the Bauhaus thought through with respect to the new industrial age, in a very small group, people coming in and rethinking industrial design, urbanism, architecture. That's what we're still living on. This is Bauhaus, this is Bauhaus, this is Bauhaus, what you're sitting on at Bauhaus. So they nailed it, and it spread around the world for decades. It was a total remaking of the built environment of the world of artifacts. But we're moving away from this, and state capitalism, and particularly the most extreme form, which is kind of communism or socialism, was no longer viable with the next stage, which we're coming to here. But you can see as well the social organization of the institutional organigram of a corporate or bureaucratic administrative apparatus, whether it's government or industrial, doesn't matter, is exactly the diagram of institutional buildings, of modernism. Separation, specialization, repetition. And it's super simple, There's three things. There's an axis of administrative, there's a residential, a wing, and then there is at the intersection, there's a kind of retail hub. So the question of freedom versus equality, of market versus state, needs to be posed anew in each historical epoch. So this is a kind of historical condition. Now, socialism had to collapse. Britain was, with all its kind of nationalized economies, was falling so behind, and you needed, it was so bad that Thatcher revolution was possible, and Hayek finally got the Nobel Prize and also was heard because the system couldn't continue, but it's also an historical condition. I don't have to read all this, but I mean, that's a symbol of this, where these kind of modernist satellite cities, sleeping cities, were just dynamite, and people voted against them with their feet. They pulled out and moved back to the historic centers. This kind of urban renaissance, a reconvergence of the historic city, and this kind of layering of new buildings into old cities, that collage city, that's the moment of postmodernism, deconstructivism. And we're still within that process of urban concentration and layering with parametricism as well. And the result is this kind of raw agglomeration at this stage, where the planners had to let go. They don't want to let go, but nobody had planned that. Even though they're trying to interfere and hamper and kind of, in a sense, kill the true discovery process of co-location synergies, still there's no sense in which any planner could ever said, I've kind of wanted that. So there's this incredible and insurmountable complexity barrier with respect to the knowledge problem of knowing what should be where and what should be next to what and how much of what. That's the discovery process. But cities all over the planet look like this. We should learn to love it. We should be kind of thrilled, and this kind of lust for complexity, but there's also something menacing about it, and I'll come to that later. But also we're moving from a kind of social physiognomy and sense of identity and sensibility from left to right, and we're moving into postmodernism, and you have kind of these kind of phenomena. And this, I call it garbage spill urbanization, because I also have a critique of this, but the first thing we have to recognize, this is better than the top line. That sterile, monotonous, cannot express the new kind of level of differentiation of lifestyles and social roles and the dynamism and mixity and connectiveness required in our contemporary life processes. So postmodernism comes on, expresses some of this, diversifying. Language or architecture must speak, must individualize, and then you move from postmodernism to deconstructivism. Is this kind of that search for complexity, layeredness, and variation, not using historical models where you found that's the first thing you kind of hooked onto, particularly also when you went back to historic centers, is now kind of abstracted and more empowered. So the move from postmodernism to deconstructivism is progress, and also this kind of radical layeredness and inter-articulation of various systems when you actually go back and layer and superimpose a new set of structures into the old textures. You get these kind of models, and you get a kind of aestheticization of the raw agglomeration in a drawing like Libeskind. The deconstructivist aesthetic is a kind of aestheticization of the neoliberal, non-planned, raw agglomeration of cities. And you get models like this. This is Libeskind's contribution and idea of a Berlin urbanization. And I think it would have been great. It would have been the better solution. So the conservatism of the planning regime prevented that. And we did, this is the early 90s at Columbia University, this kind of intensive layering. And it was already different from deconstructivism because these layers are now kind of correlated and interfacing. We start to use computer. We just have to throw things. We can let things kind of self-organize and become more complex and varied and integrated and continuous and get a sense of complex, variegated order back into urbanism and not just raw sense of disorder. So we need to move and start to align the socioeconomic epochs or align the architectural epochal styles with socioeconomic epochs. And that makes sense because there's no point in changing a style, paradigms, methodologies, repertoires which you think architecture for a good reason. We're always forced to do that. Why would we? We didn't have to. And that's why you can radical transformations in style and paradigm, which is the same thing, are forced upon us by the changing societal condition and also perhaps new opportunities, which you can no longer ignore and have to use to deliver effective, better solutions to clients. So with respect to modernism was this kind of new mass mechanical reproduction society, mass society, as well as steel and concrete as new means. And the same thing now with this parametricism, we have this new complexity and dynamism of highly dense and intricate and interlocking, and ever incomplete and ever evolving societal structures. And we have new means to deliver towards this with new computational generative processes of design. And both of these are, in a sense, forced upon us, and that hasn't arrived yet everywhere is because the argument hasn't won, and not everybody has woken up that these are the superior solutions and the better cities. So this was what we've reached at. What exists now is kind of a collage city, and what we are doing, proposing, which is a kind of parametricism city, is a theory still, but will come. So parametricism, I mean, we're working differently now. We're working with generative system, dynamical system, algorithms, self-organizing to generate much more intricate and complex pattern and textures. And so you can't solve this new task with ruler and compass and repetition. So these don't work great. And it's typical, the embedding into the existing, this layering in and embedding in that palimpsest building, but also this openness, continuously flowing, ever-changing space. Flat surfaces, we have this kind of animate and client and responsive. Also this opening up, this intervisibility when everything communicates with everything else, rather than remaining isolated and separate. You want to come into a tower and not thousands of people hidden at different floors and different cells, and you only can go to you have to kind of navigate through kind of vertical city buildings we're doing. Instead of stereotypes, you have an open, interpretable, appropriable texture of various social configuration potentials, allowing for social experimentation, if you like. And you have these kind of spaces which are neither just endless repeated cells nor vast open space, but the kind of porous, continuous in all direction, articulated with niches, subspaces. You have an articulation of various zones, which are nevertheless at the same time open to each other. So you belong to an open, continuous a process of connections and flow, but also you have places and distinct zones and characters in these. And these kind of space of three-dimensional layering of, you have several hundred small companies, our own companies in there. You have retail, food, beverages, co-working zones, even on the ground floor. You have this kind of, these are the components, I believe, of the new post for the city, where it's about coming together, mixing. So it's atria, internal, connecting up the various spaces, bridges, connecting the various buildings, a lot of outdoor spaces. Actually, this campus is quite beautiful in this sense. A lot of interaction and outdoor space in between spaces. And then an overall order which allows you to navigate that. And curvature helps you to find complex trajectories in the face, maintaining legibility in the face of complexity. That's why we use curvature. Also, the kind of distinction between convex and concave, you're inside and outside, and there's more kind of legibility in these spaces. And this idea of thousands and hundreds of people being inter-aware, inter-visible, and intercommunicated in spaces like this we're building right now. So instead of this random agglomeration or endless repetition, we have variation, differentiation, and you can lock in and adapt to existing conditions. So we kind of lawful variation and differentiation. I think something like this would emerge more spontaneously in a totally free market. And I'll talk to you later how I argue this. I will not talk too much about this, the next stage of pragmatism. So instead of these kind of fluid and soft surfaces, we have a much wider range of types of surfaces and geometries. We've absorbed a lot of engineering intelligence, environmental intelligence, fabrication logics. So we have a much more variety, but we have the same pliancy and adaptiveness. But we have a highly matured in terms of technological sophistication, lightness, and efficiency and optimization, at the same time a hugely increased expressive repertoire for the articulation of social order, for the semiological system in these latest stage of pragmatism, which is matured in the last decade. And it also goes to furniture design, and it's highly sophisticated and very characterful in particular, and multiple, and not just these NURB surfaces, kind of polished. So there's a hugely increased repertoire at the same time, like the endless forms of nature. And all of that we need to articulate this continuous three-dimensional moving and connecting spatial flows. And this is different campus designs, for instance, for Google Campus. And when we talk Google Campus, we're talking 6,000, 10,000, 12,000 people, many, many different types of departments. And we're trying to use systems which differentiate the various spaces. And you see these shells are very good to see the unity. You can see that what if two spaces intersect. You can have various degrees of density and size and nesting and transparency. There's one design at DSD Harvard, another one with these grid shells, another one with catenaries, each trying to have a huge differentiation and variation of grain, of texture, of space. But at the scale of this, each of them becomes monotonous. So we need all three of them together, or we need the different types of semiology coming out of tectonism. So you have different formations, different colors, materiality. So there's similarity across and distinction. Both similar, what belongs together and is distinct in both directions. So you have a network of similitude and contrast for the semiological project, but the palette is not some kind of random color coding like in a traffic sign, but actually the tectonic material engineering logics would become a palette of articulating societal differences and sub-departments and spaces. And the same is with environmental logics imprinting themselves and differentiating the direction at which you look at a place. And you get interesting, porous, open, varied spaces. They give you order and orientation. There's wind flowing in from one side, sun kept out of the other, but this also gives you visual orientation and unity across two subsystems which are both driven by the same parameter. And you get a very open, let's say, research campus here like this. So these are the means and articulatory means of parametrism applied to a typical post-Fordist condition like a research campus, with courtyards, with etc. etc. We had that a few times, and I'm just walking through this. And when we look at the social relations which underlying this kind of productive systems, and we look at the dynamic ecosystem, and we look at corporate structures and the labor process and work process, is really at the heart of the social process, because that would derives when you build your life around your work requirements. You move with the family where the work is, you live in that pattern, which makes you more productive, because that's natural, because that what gives you material freedom and prosperity, and you can arrange so you not necessarily live with your grandparents and brothers and sisters who all fly into different cities around the world. You have you also yourself mobile. Your friends are maybe only for a few years and not decades. I mean, you give up a lot of things to be more productive. You have an urban life. You start to love urban density, and etc. etc. And you have these kind of changes. And if you look at what happened spontaneously, not with an architecture, from these kind of modernist grid to these kind of swarm formations in the Bureau Landschaft of the 70s, they're anticipating the sense that parametricism swarm, interlocking swarms. So you can see that that what we actually doing is congenial to what the most high-performance business environments need. Parametricism is high-performance architecture for social. You can radicalize that into 3 dimensions. So and this is the kind of, and you can also dynamize this insatiable thirst for variation. And you can imagine these kind of textures being more articulate. If you imagine endless floors and endless gray grid of tables, you don't know who is where's one department, where's another, where are these characters, what's going on. It's totally disorienting. That monotony is as disorienting as the kind of raw agglomeration. So we're having these kind of spaces, and we're starting to populate them with social process simulations. So as I said, always bring the people, always bring the interaction processes into the systems. And this is the kind of interesting research. Look at how these Google and high-performance technology companies, how they work, what kind of social relationships they have, how they interact with each other, what mores and morals and sensibilities they have, but also what environments they occupy. And that is kind of telling and interesting. And that, again, that these thresholds and distinctions are no longer physically controlling. We need to be inter-aware and inter-observant, and we then use communicating thresholds to order ourselves into situations rather than physical barriers and fences. And that's the kind of sign of progress. But also we need these kind of substrates to self-order into. A gray neutral surface would be bland and wouldn't allow for anything to agglomerate quickly and determinatively. So we need this kind of structuration of the field, and now we need to test it out with information. So these kind of complexity of social relations, networks, interlocking domains, you're part of many social circles. How do you express this architecturally? You're part of many teams within a firm. You're part of many life circles, and they should intersect in the territories you're moving in. And for that, you need open, non-physical barriers. You need thresholds. You can, in these kind of textures, you can be multiply positioned with various degrees of belonging. And we can start to have these open settings and understanding what they mean and test them out through these kind of simulations. These kind of swarm formations of furniture. And they can also reconfigure and become mobile and active, and they become intelligent, and you have a social process between AI-empowered furnishings and human beings who understand these signals and signs and what's going on and the situation as it evolves. And within one day, you have many more situations and participations and communications of meaningful kind than another one. And I leave you with these. So we're now developing these open, porous, differentiated, and intricate spaces, which are also partly kinetic. And we're trying to animate and have so-called life process modeling to tease out the social functionality and get a handle on that and test them out, which is kind of a simultaneity of many different characters. We're doing crowd models with different departmental affiliations, people with different social roles, different activities, visitors, firm, consultants, etc., and develop these models and homing in on social functionality in this fashion. Thank you.